You're listening to the North American Soccer Network, online at nasn.tv.
This is John Strong. You're listening to Soccer Made in Portland.
Welcome Timbers owner and president, Merritt Paulson.
This might take away your Merritt Paulson tweets segment.
No, we already did the Merritt Paulson Twitter update just to make sure we got it in. Garth Lagerway, Real Salt Lake General Manager.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate having me on.
An interview that we did with Kenny Cooper.
Thanks so much. Appreciate you guys. Thanks for the kind words.
Jim Rylett, he is the Timbers U23 coach.
For whatever reason, you have Kelly there because he's really not very good at what he does.
Opinions, yes. Factual information, that remains to be seen.
That's never stopped us before.
Good Tuesday morning, everybody, and welcome to Soccer Made in Portland. It's always nice to have Jim Rylett crush Kelly early in the morning, coming off a Timbers weekend. This is Mao speaking. Kelly McLean here, as I mentioned. As always, Kelly, how are you doing?
Quite well. Enjoying a lovely Tuesday morning.
Yeah, it's. I guess it's lovely. It's sort of what to expect this time of year.
Uh-huh.
We have a lot to talk about. And it is mostly going to focus on the Timbers surprising, I don't know, win over the weekend in Vancouver on Sunday. Very, very big win, Cascadia Cup winning victory, and all of that. So we will talk about that. Be sure to check us out, though, on our show page at nasn.tv, where you can find links to subscribe to the show so you can get it as soon as it's available via podcast. You can also listen live on nasnradio.com. Hello to anybody listening that way. And the show is replayed later in the week as well. We've got iTunes and RSS links if you're interested in keeping up with the show in that way. So yeah, let's talk about this game, because it was we sort of had our show on Friday and we talked about the game, and then as soon as the show was over, we started talking about it, sort of comparing it to that, or hoping it would compare to that DC United game from last year, which we completely forgot to talk about actually on the show, which was a major slip up on that one. But it in the end, it didn't really turn out that way. It wasn't this sort of frantic game where both teams were sort of going for it. I suppose the Timbers had the lead in that for a while, and that's partly the reason why they weren't necessarily gunning for it in the second half. But Vancouver didn't really fight back in the way that sort of we were talking about from that DC Portland game last year. So let's start with sort of initial thoughts on kind of how the game played out, and then we can get into some specifics.
Well, I mean, I was a little surprised. Obviously, I standard picked the Timbers to lose because they were out on the road. Yeah, I mean, overall, I definitely wouldn't call it a pretty game. There were some lengthy spells that were pretty ugly. There were a lot of fouls. I forget the total, but the whistle was blowing every 30 seconds, it seemed like. So it was a lot of start and stop. It was tough to get into either team really to get into much of a rhythm. Not the best played game, but on the other hand, sometimes you have those games that are just sort of ugly and stop and go, and you kind of have to find a way to get sort of an ugly, difficult win, and credit to the Timbers for doing that, sort of gutting out one of these, less than stellar sort of victories, but they did what they needed to get done on the road. So it was nice to see. I mean, it's definitely nice that they secure the Cascadia Cup. They don't have to be one of these, 5 other MLS teams to never win a game on the road during the course of a season. So good for a number of reasons, which I think might be just enough to give everybody, at least take the bad taste out of their mouth from perhaps the last couple of weeks or month or so. And maybe they can continue that with a win in their final game at home, although that could be a tall order. We'll have to see.
Yeah, that's going to be the subject of our Friday show, and maybe we'll even touch on it by the end of this show. But I think we'll see a little bit of a different outlook for the game coming up on Saturday, the season finale. But yeah, I agree with you. It wasn't the best game I've ever seen from the Timbers or the Whitecaps for that matter. It was not as interesting in general, apart from sort of the built-in drama of. Are the Timbers going to hold on? Are they going to be able to win this game? That was sort of built in, and obviously that made it sort of a nail biter, especially as the referee awarded 6 minutes of injury time. And I think everybody in Portland probably thought the same thing I did, which was, oh my God, that's just enough time for Vancouver to score the equalizer and make this all for naught. In the end, it didn't happen that way, but. I'm pretty sure everybody felt that way when they announced the number. So yeah, I mean, but it wasn't as interesting a game. It wasn't as compelling a game. I didn't think sort of throughout as even the other two games between the two teams were. There were a couple of areas where I kind of was before the goal, before Jewsbury scored, where I was convinced the Timbers were not going to win, and it was not because they weren't. It's not that they were being dominated or anything like that. I just felt like for most of the first half, it just seemed like there was no way. It seemed to me there was no way Bright DK was going to get past Jay DeMerit, and I just felt certain that Camilo was going to get past the Portland center backs. And Camilo had a couple of good chances. He had an early header which produced a pretty good save from Donovan Ricketts, and he pulled another shot wide a little bit later, and he certainly had his chances. They were contested for sure, but I just had this sense that he was going to figure it out, and that DK was just overmatched by DeMerit, and we've seen DK physically overmatch other players. And I thought when, for example, Andy O'Brien was ending up on DK at different points, whether they switched off or he just ended up, having to be that guy, that DK looked a lot better. The DK created some chances when it was O'Brien on him, whether it was winning a header or, taking it, he put a shot into the side net, which was actually deflected out by Knighton. Those were with O'Brien on him. And I just felt like when DeMerit was on DK, that was a problem for the Timbers. That he just couldn't get going, and that's not a knock on DK. I mean, Jay DeMerit's a great defender. That happens, but I thought that kind of exposed a little bit of a weakness in the Timbers, that they just didn't really have much of an answer for that. But as the game kept going, I felt like things sort of leveled out. I felt like the Timbers stopped trying to get the ball to DK at every opportunity. I felt like a lot in the first half. They get the ball out wide to Zizo on the right, and he'd try and send something into DK, or they try and play him through, and it wasn't completely unsuccessful. It just wasn't really generating much offense, and I felt like as the game kind of evolved, we saw Songo'o and Nagbe switching back and forth a little bit. I know you want to talk about that, and I just felt like the Timbers, they kind of got the goal coming from the left side instead of the right, which is. I felt like most of the game to that point they had been trying to play through the right. So let's talk about the goal, the eerily similar to Kenny Cooper goal from last year, and kind of how all that's set up. Yeah,
I mean, a great goal from Jack, and I thought he had a really good game. I want to characterize it as sort of understated, which maybe that's an oxymoron considering that he scores this brilliant goal. But I think the rest of the time, as we've seen in a lot of games, he isn't the focal point. He isn't the first guy that you sort of see doing stuff when you watch the game. But he's just very calm. He's very solid. We've talked about it for a while. This new role that he's in really suits him very well. Is sort of being in that that last guy back of those center midfielders, and helping with possession and helping with defending and going forward when he gets a chance. I thought he had a really good game elsewhere outside of of the fact that he scored, the brilliant goal, which, as you mentioned, was eerily similar to Kenny Cooper's from last year. We were talking beforehand. Virtually the same spot on the field. He might have been in towards the center a little bit more and perhaps a bit further away from goal than Cooper, but right in that same area. Ball is in both cases bouncing. I think in Cooper's case, it was sort of maybe one big bounce and he took it out of the air. And Jewsbury's, it was, maybe two smaller hops, but, taking it sort of on the volley for each of those. And Jack sort of hits it more with the outside of his foot, and Cooper got more of that dipping action to go over the goalkeeper. But yeah, sort of weird that just identical sort of goals, identical score, same sort of scenario. Pretty interesting. But, Jack isn't, as we all know, he can score goals. In college, he was a forward. He scored lots of goals. And he does just have that knack, that ability that some guys have to hit long-range shots. We've seen it time and time again. You think about somebody like Juninho in L.A., who just has that knack. That's just that special gift that he has. Or opposed to perhaps somebody like, I don't know, Lavelle Palmer, who likes to think he has that knack, but obviously does not.
Yeah, James Marceline.
Yeah, James Marceline. He's just got that ability to hit that long-range ball. It's just so wonderful to watch. It was just a tremendous goal.
Yeah, and to me, the key to the whole thing, it looked to me in real time and watching the replay that Stephen Smith wasn't trying to pass it to Songo'o.
No, not at all.
I mean, he hit that way harder than he would have. So I don't know if Songo'o just got in the way or if he just smartly, trapped it or whatever. But he knows this is what you get when you get guys together for a whole season. Mm-hmm. Everybody in the world knows that Jewsbury is going to hit a better shot off that little half volley than he is if the ball is sitting on the ground. And it's not that he can't hit the ball off the ground, but he likes those, bouncing where it's, maybe he can smack it from about a foot off the ground. And that's some of the goals that he scored. That one that he scored, the left-footed one earlier this year. Some ones that he scored last year. Similar distance or similar type things. The ball's bouncing a little bit. That's his shot. That's the one he always tries, and he tries it a lot when he doesn't score too. I mean, they don't always go in, but for Songo'o he didn't trap it and lay it, just push it to him on the floor. He kind of flipped it out there so that it would bounce once or twice and give Jewsbury the chance to run onto it. And that was just perfect. And honestly, I don't think earlier in the season that shot could have even happened. Now, he could have still scored. He could have still gotten a great shot off the floor. But at this point in the season, Songo'o knows Jack wants it bouncing a little bit, and he's able to bring in that ball from Smith, lay it off perfectly. Those are the kinds of shots that the Timbers often give up. Not that they always go in, but there's nobody there. Like you can sort of watch that from a Vancouver perspective and go, where are the defensive midfielders? Like what's happened here? I mean, some of the guys were obviously dropped off into the box, and maybe rightfully so. But those spaces do open up from time to time. We know Diego Chara doesn't really take shots like that very often. And Jack's the one guy who's gonna, from that part of the field in that position, who's gonna hit it. And he hit it. I mean, he hit it, and it was a perfect shot. I mean, I'm not even sure the ball bounced inside the goal line after it hit the net. I mean, I think it bounced all the way back out of the goal on the fly. I mean, he really smacked it, and it was great. It was a great goal, and it gave the Timbers something that they haven't really had. And it's not that they haven't had a lead in different games, because they have, and it's not like they haven't had a lead in away games, which they have. But it gave them a chance. They got the lead a lot closer to halftime than what they've done in other circumstances. So, like, when they went up by 2 goals in New York, it was really early, and it gave New York a chance to kind of reset and get some of those goals back before halftime. This one, I mean, it wasn't right up at the end, but it kind of gave the Timbers a chance to sort of weather that little bit right afterward, and then get into halftime with the lead and not feel like things were already falling apart. something that sort of intrigued me was Vancouver's setup from the start, which I don't, to be fair, I haven't paid enough attention to what they trot out game in, game out, home versus away, when they need to win, when they're just trying to draw, whatever. I don't know who they usually put out there. But to me, they had Kofi, Robson, Rochat, and Watson in the midfield, or at least sort of above the defenders, depending on how you want to define what Rochat's role was. But that's a pretty defensive setup. I mean, those are guys who certainly can go forward. I mean, Robson is going to try and lift the ball with his left foot and play it onto somebody. He tried it time and time again. He did it here in Portland, same way. We've seen Kofi strike a ball from distance, and same with Rochat. But that is not an overly aggressive lineup. I mean, there wasn't when Dane Richards came in, I kind of remembered, oh yeah, they have Dane Richards. Why didn't And I don't know if that was because he was tired from international duty or what, but they didn't really seem to be going for it, even from the start, in the way that I thought that they might try and just take the game early and then kind of sit on it and just play the game out, knowing that if they lost, there was the chance that if Dallas won, all of a sudden this playoff thing is up for grabs. In the end, it didn't matter, but they didn't know that at the time. The Dallas-Seattle game was after the Portland-Vancouver game, so they came out in a setup that really surprised me in its sort of kind of how passive it was, and you could sort of see that playing out. I mean, both of us were impressed by Gershon Kofi. I mean, he was very good and sort of did kind of a combination of what Chara and Jewsbury provide for the Timbers in the body of one guy. And he is his evolution I think I meant to look this up and I forgot, but I think the first time we saw him was in the 2010 playoffs. He joined Vancouver, joined the first team at about the same time that Khalif Al-Hassan joined the Timbers, right at the end of 2010. And he played in the playoffs, and he looked like a teenager. I mean, he looked like a guy who was really raw. You could tell he had skills. And to see where he is now, just 2 years later, I mean, he's not a star, but he is a solid, polished player, and with a very specific role. And it's not a flashy role, and it's not a goal-scoring role, but that's the kind of player, if you have a young guy like that, you can really build something around that type of player. I was very impressed with him. But when you surround him with Robeson and Rochat and Watson, each of whom are good and fine, but they didn't have anybody sort of trying to really create things through the middle, because that kind of fell to Robson, and he just apart from that sort of that shot that he lifted just a little high and left in the second half, which is a pretty good shot. Those guys didn't really do anything offensively, and they kind of left it all to Miller and Camilo to try and create things. They did in the first half. In the second half, that kind of fell off. And I was just really surprised by that. And I think that played into Portland's hands, because Vancouver had to make some changes in order to sort of spark their attack. So I mean, they took Camilo off, who was basically their best player offensively, before the 70th minute to get Maddox in there. I get that. That's a smart move. Richards got about a half an hour, but that's you're going into the second half now. I mean, yeah. I just think they gave Portland the perfect opportunity to kind of sit on a lead and not threaten them coming right out of halftime. And by that point, I thought the Timbers did a pretty nice job of settling in and withstanding what came through the rest of the game.
Yeah, I was a little surprised, particularly early on in the first half, just to see that the times when they did sort of get some possession, Vancouver, and move forward, they didn't bring a lot of numbers. I mean, they were happy to have Miller and Camilo try to work something out and maybe have one other guy come see what he could do or serve a ball in or something. I was really surprised that they weren't pressing more. again, we mentioned last year's game against DC, and this wasn't quite that, cut and dry a scenario, but I think we both thought that we would see a game more like that just because the team's wanting to go and get something out of it. And I was surprised at the way Vancouver came out, and didn't think they really pushed forward much to really try and go press the issue. Particularly early on, from both sides, the first 10 to 15 minutes, that was some of the ugliest, most ridiculous soccer I have seen. It was atrocious. I wrote down, it was the only thing that happened were long balls, offside calls, fouls, and poor passes. And that was about it. And you also had Ricketts making his save with flair. He made that one save and then kicked his legs out and fell to the ground that we've seen before one other time, I think, from him adding a little more extra to it. And we saw a couple kind of half chances in there. In that first 15 minutes, I think is when we saw Stephen Smith trying to do I don't know exactly what, and like putting a shot on goal that Ricketts was there to deflect away. I mean, I guess he was trying to knock that out over the end line for a corner, but it sure seemed like an odd decision when he could have just cleared it back out the way he was facing. I mean, it's not like there was a defender, I think, coming from behind him, running in from the other side of the field. So I get that, that there's somebody coming in on your back, but there was nobody in front of you. And I mean, maybe you're not supposed to clear the ball back across the face of goal, but there was literally nothing in front of you. You could have taken your left foot or your right foot and just, not even put your full weight behind it. I mean, just stuck your foot out and sent it back the way it came, as opposed to trying to flick it out over the end line and give up a corner and accidentally misdirect it back straight onto your own goal. That was an odd moment. That was going on. I mean, that was a horrible first 15 minutes of soccer. I was so surprised seeing that. I don't know if it was nerves. I don't know. I don't think that moment was too big for either of those clubs or the players on the field, even though they're sort of young teams in terms of their MLS existence. Both of those teams have sort of veteran players on those teams. It's not like it was a game like last year against DC where both teams have nothing to lose and they need to go score and win. I mean, there was something to play for, but it didn't seem like it was too big of a moment that you would get that. You typically see that when you get a championship game, the MLS Cup, the Super Bowl, and everybody talks about, all right, the first 5 minutes are going to be a little chaotic here. We're not talking about a game to that level. I was surprised that the first 15 minutes was just a whole bunch of junk. It was really surprising.
Yeah, you're exactly right about Smith. I mean, almost anything would have been better than shooting at your own near post. I mean, that was, I heard some people say after the game that, that was the best chance Vancouver had was Smith's shot. And that's not quite accurate, but it kind of seemed like it. And actually that leads us into a little bit of a discussion we can have about the outside backs, because I thought in the end, when you look at the whole game, I thought Smith played pretty well, but there were definitely moments, especially early, and especially that one that you just described, where Smith was, was kind of curious, like what is he doing? Kimura was equally poor in the beginning of the game, letting passes, just run out of bounds, making poor passes himself, getting beaten around the corner. None of it's stuff that we haven't seen before, but I kind of thought to myself early in the game, this kind of makes you wonder about the Seattle game, where everybody was so up in arms about these the use of Wallace and Palmer and how that was the thing that destroyed the Timbers' chances in Seattle. And it was kind of like, well, look at these guys. These guys aren't any better. I mean, there's nothing better about what you're seeing right now Now, I think they both kind of got better, and as I mentioned, Smith especially ended up, I think, having an okay game. But and ultimately, neither of them did cost the Timbers, a goal. But those are definitely, those are positions that I think we know, and we're not breaking news here, but that the Timbers need to address. They just have to. They just have to get someone better than what they've got in those positions. If nothing else, simply to allow the team to sort of stay where they are and not have a worry in every game about what is going to happen to us in this game at the outside back position. It can sort of focus somewhere else. So it doesn't even have to be a star, just someone who gives you a level of consistency that, I think when Smith is on his game, that's the kind of consistency the Timbers are looking for. I mean, I think of the guys who have played outside back, I think Jewsbury actually did reasonably well at right back when he was in there. But for the most part, I think Smith, when he's been good, is a good enough left back to say that's not something we have to worry about in this game. But he's also had performances, and he's admitted it, to be fair, where he hasn't been up to par. So that game just highlighted again to me the need for it. And to be honest, Vancouver really didn't even try to exploit it. I mean, they weren't playing with a lot of flair or a lot of speed on the wings. I mean, the kind of fanciest thing I saw was when Matt Watson, flipped the ball over Smith's head and then played the cross into Camilo the shot I mentioned that he pulled wide. I mentioned earlier, that came from Watson kind of on the right, the Timbers left, and that was pretty fancy. But Matt Watson is not a super impressive, super fat. He's not Ryan Smith or some guy or Sal Zizzo. I mean, he's not a guy who's going to try and kill you down the wings. So that certainly helped Smith and Camora, and I think contain Vancouver a little better, partly because there wasn't that much that they had to contain. But I think would the Timbers have lost if they'd played Rodney Wallace and Lavelle Palmer? I don't know. I just don't think in this particular game that was a position that was going to cost them something because of the setup that Vancouver ended up using, that they could have used any of those four guys in any combination, and that it wouldn't have it. Fans, I think, would have been angry had Wallace and Palmer been back out there because of the sort of backlash that happened after the Seattle game. But I don't think that unless they just had the worst games of their lives, I don't think what their strengths and weaknesses are would have changed the outcome of this game very much.
No, I don't think so either. But also, I think you were right. You mentioned it earlier. Vancouver, I think, could have taken advantage and didn't. I don't know if that was the way it played out for them, or if that was something that they were trying to attack in a different way or something. But it sure seemed like something they could have taken advantage of and didn't. Smith has been out for a while, and I thought his performance was fine given that he was coming back off a lengthy layoff. For him, he started slow, but I think by the end of the game, he had a decent game, and I think you're right. I think moving forward, I'm fine with Smith. Early on, we've talked about this a number of times. Early on, when he first got here, it was not good for a while, but he has settled in, and I really like most of what he does. And most of the time, I think he's good out there. I think he's a guy you can pencil in and say, hey, we've got a starting left back that I think we're comfortable with. We might need a different backup. Worst case scenario, we've got Wallace, although that's kind of a whole different story because we keep seeing Wallace in a lot of different places, and we wonder what Caleb Porter's thinking about him and his price tag. So maybe we need a different backup. But I think people are fine in general with Stephen Smith as your starting left back. Clearly, though, at right back, what we've seen the past 2 weeks is that, we need to go searching again for another right back. And I think most people would argue that Jewsbury has been the team's best right back so far this season. So, I mean, how telling is that? that he goes back there and plays better than guys who are specifically brought in to play back there. So definitely an issue moving forward. I think there were issues during the game. You mentioned that one sequence where Watson flipped it up over Smith and then crossed it in. And I think Miller may have headed it on to Camilo.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
And, Kimura was not tracking real well there. And, Camilo should have punished him, but didn't. And like you said, I mean, there were other issues with Kimura. So, again, nothing new. We're not breaking any news here. We're just reaffirming and confirming what we already know. And they have got to go out. And what we've known for a while, that the team has been looking for outside backs for what, ever?
2 years?
Since day one.
Since Kerry Gilbert didn't show up,
since
basically.
Kerry Gilbert didn't show up, and we've had Purdy and Hall out there, and nothing has worked. And Palmer came in and seemed to do fine for half a season when he came in, at least an adequate job. But apparently that all fell apart at the beginning of this year. I don't know what changed for him, but I don't know. So, yeah, nothing new there. But I think we still know where some problems lie with this team and what needs to be addressed.
Definitely. Now, we got to mention Hanyer Mosquera going down again. We couldn't talk about this game without mentioning that. Eric Brunner was sort of forced to come back on. It wasn't hard to divine this, but Footy Dansu was not going to be on that trip. He was not going to be there. So if somebody came out, it was going to be Brunner coming in. Sure enough, that happened. So what did you think about Brunner? How do you think he did? He was on for just under half of the game. I mean, first couple of minutes of the second half. So he got a full half in. What did you think of his performance?
I thought it was fine. It didn't look like the Brunner that we've seen, Brunner at his best, but I thought it was fine considering that was his first significant minutes with the first team in how long? I mean,
5 months.
Yeah, I think considering all that, I thought it was fine. I'm a little puzzled. I'm really curious to hear more about Mosquera because just seeing it live and watching a couple replays, I mean, it really didn't look like anything. And sometimes those, when you're talking about a knee, sometimes those are the scariest ones because it doesn't look like anything, and yet the guy's got to go out, and that really makes you worry. So I'm curious to know what we hear back, this coming week about Mosquera because it didn't look like much, when it happened on the field and you saw the replays. So I don't know. I mean, Mosquera hasn't given us any indication to think that he's not a tough guy and wouldn't play through some pain. But that one didn't look like much, and he immediately came out. So I'm curious to hear what the diagnosis of that is.
Yeah, and you had some interesting ideas about sort of set pieces and stuff too. Just the relative differences between Mosquera and the other central defenders. Since
we're, I guess, on the topic of Mosquera, it just sort of hit me. I think once again, at least on the TV broadcast, and this isn't something uncommon. You hear it a lot, not just on Timbers broadcast, but everywhere, is, corners or set pieces, and teams bring their big center backs forward. And so, again, there was an instant free kick, corner, something, and Strong said something about, the Timbers are going to, send the big trees forward. And it just got me thinking, that Mosquera, for being a big guy and a physical guy and a guy who wins a lot of headers, it just sort of curious that he's rarely involved and in the mix on these corners and free kicks. I mean, Horst has scored off of these. Brunner has scored off of these. Footy has scored off of these. And not just have they scored, but it seems like those are the three names that you constantly hear when you're listening to a broadcast and the broadcaster is calling the game and saying, Horst got ahead to that one, or boy, Bruner was crashing in there. Bodies were flying everywhere, and he almost got to that one. Or Footy again is in the mix, battling guys, getting up, almost got that one turned on frame. But we never hear Mosquera's name called in that stuff. And I think I think he scored once. Was it the Oregon State?
Can't remember. He had an own goal as well in the preseason.
You're right. He had an own goal, and I think in the preseason he scored one other goal.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, it wasn't Oregon State. I don't think it was. It was another one. I think, but I can't remember. But yeah, you're right. He did. He did do that.
That's it. Like, he's had that one goal in a preseason game, and it's almost like he certainly hasn't scored one since. And yet on top of that, we hardly ever hear his name about even being in the mix or up for challenging for those set pieces, those corners, those free kicks. But yet we constantly hear Bruner's name and Footy's name and Horst's name. And it just sort of struck me as odd. It's just sort of an interesting thing that this guy, who should be one of those big trees that they bring forward, that you should have to worry about every set piece, we just rarely hear his name called, and we rarely see him getting ahead on the ball or getting involved or in the mix. I don't know. It's just odd.
Yeah, and I'm sorry. You were right. Mosquera did score against Oregon State in that preseason game, which is the barn burner of a 1-0 game that the Timbers won on a late. I mean, it was like the 84th minute. Then Mosquera scored. And I should throw out there that Jean-Baptiste has scored this season as well from the center back position. So, it is a bit curious. I mean, maybe that's just not in his repertoire. I mean, maybe that's just not, but that's a little bit, that doesn't have to be in your repertoire, but it's a little disappointing because the Timbers, at least to this point, set pieces, not as much as last year, but even this year too, set pieces have accounted for a number of goals and have certainly accounted for a number of close calls or times where they put pressure on the other team. And that, just doesn't really seem to include Mosquera at all. I mean, he's in there, but he's just not really causing anybody any problems. I mean, he's just kind of there.
Yeah, and that has to be, when they brought him here, that had to have been part of the conversation, like, this is another guy that we're going to add to these big center backs that will give us that continued presence on set pieces. Like, he's just going to continue that pattern of what we've done really well in that area, and yet it's been completely missing.
Now, to be fair, he is only 6'1", relative to the 6'3" and 6'4" of Footy and Bruner and Horst. So he is a little bit, in terms of height, a little shorter. But yeah, I'm not sure that should totally account for it.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we'll spend some of the offseason talking about things like that when we're looking for stuff to talk about. Another thing you wanted to mention was sort of the, and we have talked about this a lot, but sort of the interplay, or not the interplay necessarily, but the exchanging of positions within the game between Franck Songo'o and Darlington Nagbe. And I'll throw this out here first before you say what you want to say. I felt like when Nagbe moved out to the left, when the times when he was playing out wide, that he was just completely invisible. That when he is in the middle, he's involved a lot more. And I remember one time them switching, him moving in. I don't think it was a positional change as much as just sort of the way the flow of the game happened. Nagbe wound up in the middle. It was in the first half, I think, and ended up controlling the ball and dribbling it upfield and passing it around and was actively involved in the attack in a way that he simply had not been at all. I mean, I didn't even remember him touching the ball prior to that. And, I was almost about to say to the people I was watching the game with, where is Nagbe? And then, of course, he immediately got the ball and started doing something. But that was only when he was in the middle. So I thought, and, I think it's really good to get Songo'o in the middle at times because he can do things that even Nagbe doesn't do or doesn't try. But it does kind of leave Nagbe out there on the wing without really much to do. Really, I mean, he just didn't. I didn't think he had much of an impact on the game for the most part.
Well, there it is. You stole my thunder. Thanks.
Oh, well, I'm sorry.
Well, here's, we've talked a lot about Caleb Porter and him wanting to get a look at guys and evaluate. And I just can't help but think that over the past month, I just don't know if we've learned a whole lot. I think we've mostly just had a bunch of stuff confirmed. Like, Nagbe is not Nagbe when he's out wide. I mean, how long have we been saying that? And yet the last, obviously in Vancouver and some in Seattle as well, we see him playing out wide again. And it simply confirms what we already knew, is he's not the same guy out there. He needs to be in the middle of the field. Now, maybe he hasn't been spectacular and amazing in the middle of the field, but he's certainly been better. He's certainly more comfortable. And that's certainly where, if he's going to continue to develop, that's where it's going to happen. Sort of the same thing with, our outside backs. I don't know that we learned anything new about Kimura or Palmer that we didn't already know. We just have had some stuff, confirmed for us. Or perhaps you could say the same thing about Wallace as a left back. I think we've just sort of had some things confirmed for us. But putting Nagbe out wide, it's worthless. It just doesn't get you anything. He needs to be in the middle. That's where he can be most effective. And I know that he hasn't been maybe as flashy or as direct and as people want, a guy like Nagbe to be in there, but he keeps the ball. And Songo'o in the middle, we've talked before about how he takes some chances. He's that guy who's going to take some people one-on-one. He's going to do something to try to get around somebody. And you don't necessarily always want that in the middle of the field. I think Songo'o, it seems better coming from him when he starts out wide and he can do what he wants out wide near the corner flag. And those times when he comes into the middle, he'll try some stuff and it's fine, because it's not all the time. When he's just stationed in the middle of the field, it becomes too much. And I prefer Nagbe in there as a guy who does a better job of just keeping the ball moving and keeping possession. And I'd rather see Songo'o more in the wide areas doing what he wants to do. And when he does come into the middle on those, more infrequent occasions, then it's okay, then it's fine. But when he starts out in the middle of the field and 80% of what he does is trying to make something happen, I think it falls apart a little bit more and causes more issues and problems. So while Songo'o is an intriguing prospect as a guy to put in that spot because of what you think he might be able to create in there, he himself really isn't like a creator and facilitator for other people. He's more of kind of like a Zizou when you get right down to it. I think he's better than Zizou. I think he's got additional attributes to Zizou where he can put some passes through and send some people in. But most of what he does is more akin, I think, to like the Zizou type guy out wide, making and creating for himself. Yes, it would be awesome if he would do some of that for other people and be that creative guy, but I don't think that's his style. I don't think that ultimately is what he's going to do. I think that's more what Nagbe can do. Maybe he hasn't done it yet to the extent that we'd like, but I think he's more capable of being that guy to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, occasionally Songo'o does send in terrific crosses, and even rarer, but still importantly, he sometimes sends in really good long balls and early crosses from the wings, which frankly, Nagbe doesn't do. And that's not necessarily bad that Nagbe doesn't do that, especially if he's playing in the middle. But when he's out wide, I mean, we don't have to hammer it home. Everybody knows, but he's not going to go to the corner and send a cross in. I mean, or get to the end line and send a cross back. That's not his game, and that's completely fine that it's not his game. But sometimes that's what the Timbers need, right. And we just don't very often see Nagbe setting up DK at the near post or something like that, where we'll see Songo'o play balls in like that when he's played out wide. We saw him do it at home a couple of times when he was set out wide, when they first switched to the sort of 4-3-3 look that got everybody all excited. So yeah, it's interesting, and we've mentioned this too before, like, or I think we have on the show, that Caleb Porter must not think Darlington Nagbe is going to play forward, because otherwise, how have we never seen him at forward? You know what I mean? Like, you would think if he was trying to decide. You know, we've seen Songo'o push up and play forward sometimes. We've seen Songo'o out wide. We've seen him in the middle. We've seen Wallace in the middle, left back, left midfield. You know, we've seen Sal drop back, to right back in odd circumstances late in games, and we've seen a lot of different things. But what we haven't really seen much of is Nagbe doing anything other than wide out left or in the middle. Mm-hmm. And that's probably because he's best in the middle, and that's a good place for him to be. That's completely fine. But we haven't really seen a lot of experimenting in the way that we've seen other guys, not necessarily where they start, but where they kind of flow in and out of within the game. That's very much a part of that sort of evaluating process too, to see, to give a guy 5 minutes. We saw Chara play out wide. I mean, that was, apart from he did have one pretty nice cross in Seattle, but otherwise that was completely pointless, but it wasn't to see, I don't think, what Chara can do out wide. It was to put different guys in the middle. So it'll be interesting next year, because it's been so long now since we've been able to look at a game and just look at it on its face and say, here's what the Timbers were trying to do, and here's what they did successfully or unsuccessfully. Because I think in this game, a little more than in some recent games, we can say they put the guys out there and just tried to have them play the way they play. But on the other hand, they put Nagbe out wide. I mean, that must have been because they thought they could get more out of Songo'o or something. But all we can do is look at it through that lens of, I wonder what Caleb Porter was thinking about. I wonder how he's going to try and take when Wallace came in for Songo'o, and I wonder how. It'll be nice and refreshing on some level, even if the Timbers are bad, to at least say, here's what they were trying to do, because we watched them do it, and that's all they were trying to do. There was nothing else behind the scenes. It was just to get the best players on the field and try and win. Now, we have to talk about, for at least a minute, or a couple minutes, the Cascadia Cup. That was sort of, it wasn't just that the Timbers won an away game, which in and of itself is a pretty big deal, or worthy of certainly mention. But they did actually win the Cascadia Cup, and it's the first time that they've ever won it when all three teams were involved. They won it in both 2009 and 10, when Seattle was in MLS and Portland and Vancouver were not. In both of those seasons, in the one game that Portland played against Seattle, they lost. Those are both Open Cup matches, but not being on relative terms as far as what league they were in. Those, I think, rightfully didn't count. And so Portland's name is on there twice already. But this is sort of the first where all three teams are involved. Of course, the other two teams and fans, I'm sure, are saying, well, yeah, but they had 4 games at home. And I think that's a completely fair thing to point out. Most of Portland's points came in the home games. I guess they got 2 wins and a draw, so they got 7 of their points in home games. So, but they won the Cascadia Cup. I mean, it was really cool to see at the end of the game. I mean, I was commenting to a friend who was there where I was watching that's the happiest I think I've seen the Timbers all year. I mean, even when they've won games and won games at home, I mean, people were pretty happy when they beat Philadelphia in the season opener. I mean, and by people, I mean the players. I mean, they were excited and smiling and happy and everything. But this just had a sense of relief about it, and a sense of release about it, that it was just like, oh God, we didn't end up being the chokers that everybody said we were going to be. That like they were happy to have won it on its face, and also happy to have not lost it. And this sense that, you could just see Kimura and Jewsbury and Horst and these guys who have had good games, but also, disappointing performances at times, get through a game and, lift this trophy over their head and just, let out a scream. And they just looked really happy. And that's just something we're not accustomed to seeing. Even when they've won this year, it's been kind of tempered by, well, we finally won, or we broke that losing streak, or we were expected to win, and thank God we did, because look how much, imagine how much worse it could have been if we hadn't. This was just like a pure, we won and feel good about it, because that's all we were trying to do today. And it doesn't matter what's happened the rest of the season. And that was really good to see. And the last thing I'll say about it before I stop talking about it for a second is, we sort of touched on this last week a little bit, that there was this idea that people almost didn't want the Timbers to win because they didn't want anything positive to come out of this year, because they want changes. And whether or not people actually wanted the Timbers to lose or not, I can understand the sentiment. If it's going to be bad, it might as well be terrible, so that if changes are coming anyway, you have nothing to hold. There's no excuse to say, yeah, well, we did this little thing at the end that actually wasn't representative of the season at all, but it just kind of happened. And I can understand that, but the reality is the majority of the guys who are on the team this year are going to be on the team next year. They're just not. People who think there are going to be 25 changes to the roster don't know anything about MLS and the roster structure and the collective bargaining agreement and the salary cap. You can't get rid of every single guy on the team. So yes, there are going to be changes, and there are going to be new faces, and there's going to be a new style, and that may mean different guys are playing than are playing now. But by and large, the guys who make up the team this year are going to make up the team next year. So it's good for them to, to carry something into the offseason that's positive. I mean, it's, to say these guys are all going to be gone, so who cares if no, they're not all going to be gone. And I would say right now, from the starting 11 that started on Sunday, if there are less than 6 or 7 of those guys the same, I'd be stunned for the opening day starting 11. I mean, I think we're going to, there's guys who are going to be on the team in the starting 11. They're just going to be, 2 or 3 years from now, things could look totally different. But I think, of course, it's good to win the Cascadia Cup, but I think it's even better than I think people are sort of talking about, because these are the guys who are going to go back out there next year, and they've got a cup to defend. They've got something to feel good about going into the offseason, despite everything that's happened, despite all the criticism from us and anyone else. That's their trophy that they can say they won and come back to defend next year.
Yeah, I just hope they don't overdo it with, at least for the Timbers, for the players, that they don't try to oversell winning the Cascadia Cup. I mean, I think that could get them in trouble too. I mean, I don't want Merritt going on Twitter and, rambling on about how, we won the Cascadia Cup and that makes everything okay. I think they just need to win it. They need to recognize and just say, hey, we won this. We're really proud of it. This is for the fans. And just sort of leave it at that and take what you can get from it. In a different year, you could write up articles, you could make videos, you could put whatever you want up on your website. The players could tweet and do whatever they want, and it would be awesome. But the way things have gone this year and the way a lot of the fan base feels about the way the season has gone, I hope they just take it, say, thank you. We're glad we could win this for you guys. This was awesome. We're going to enjoy having this in our trophy case, and just leave it at that and know that we're moving on, and that, perhaps rough times are not exactly over, and that, we're going to come back next year and try and retain it, but that they don't try to, oversell winning the Cascadia Cup this year.
Yeah, and I think so far that hasn't been the case. I think it hasn't been lorded over anybody or whatever, and that's of course partly tempered by the fact that with Seattle winning later in the evening, Vancouver did in fact qualify for the playoffs. So while Portland won the Cascadia Cup, which is a really big deal and does reflect actual achievement in head-to-head matchups, that's all it's about. It's not a strength of schedule. I mean, yes, the home games helped. And that will be interesting to pay attention to next year when the Timbers have 2 home games and 4 away games. But it's an actual achievement. Yet both Seattle and Vancouver are going to the playoffs. And again, when you line up Portland and Vancouver next to each other, they're always going to be, in the same sentence as far as MLS goes because of coming into the league at the same time. They share the expansion draft. Everything about that, aside from the fact that the Timbers have actually pretty well dominated the Whitecaps. I mean, they won 2 of the 3 games this year. They won both games last year, and they drew the other one this year. So they've actually never lost to the Whitecaps in MLS. But Vancouver's going to the playoffs, and that's something that the Timbers aspire to do. And I think while the Cascadia Cup is a really big deal, and it certainly matters to the fans, and it certainly matters to the club, I think almost anybody would trade that this season for the ability to have been in the playoffs. I think people want, partly because that means the team would have been successful all along the way, and because it provides an excitement that hasn't been here. In each of the last 2 times the Timbers made the playoffs, and even in the second division, they were already trailing on aggregate when they came back to have their final home game. So even though they won one of them and drew the other one in those 2 games, they end up losing the aggregate to Vancouver, both in 2009 and 10. Those are the last two playoff appearances. So I think. I don't think I don't think we're going to see that. I agree with you. I hope it doesn't happen, but it's good. It's good to have. It's not a permanent trophy. There's the potential that it could go to one of the other 2 cities next year. But it's good to have something to take away from this season that is positive, and is only related to this season. It isn't building toward next year. It isn't Caleb Porter's future, this or that. It's just this season, and there is something to be said for that. Now, speaking of triumphs, we should talk about fantasy really quickly before we get out of here. I had a tremendous week in fantasy. It ended up not being quite as good after Sunday's games completed. I was as high as 20th after Saturday's games. I had a big Saturday, but then not quite as much for me on Sunday. But anyway, I'm in 22nd place. You are in 34th, so you're getting close to that goal of hitting the top 30 before it's all said and done. And then Trevor again remained in 44th in an absolutely inexplicable circumstance. Literally doesn't know his login information. He has some guys on his team, I think, who aren't around anymore.
Not even be in the league anymore.
Yeah, so that remains amazing. But yeah, this is coming down to it. Both, not just for fantasy. I mean, that fantasy's fun, but the actual season, it's now going to be over. All the playoff spots are determined. I mean, all of the teams are determined. There's a couple of opportunities for teams to move up or down within within the playoff structure, so that we'll see exactly where the games will be taking place after this week. And of course, the Timbers have the very real possibility of having the MLS single season scoring record tied or broken against them coming up this weekend. So we're going to come back on Friday afternoon. It's going to be a weird one to preview because there's the potential of a lot of changes and a lot of guys can maybe get a look, maybe not, I don't know. But it should be quite a different thing to sort of look at ahead of time than either the Seattle or Vancouver games were. So join us then, 3:30 p.m. Pacific time, Friday afternoon. We'll be live on NASN.TV and NASNradio.com, and you'll be able to follow along there. We'll preview the game. It's an afternoon game on Saturday, so we'll have to make sure we get everything in. So, join us then. But until then, this is Mal.
And this is Kelly. We'll see you again on Friday.
Yeah, speak to you then.